The tall glass skyscraper of Hayes Corporation stood proudly against the city skyline. Inside its polished walls, everything seemed perfect and professional. The employees walked quickly in crisp suits, the air was filled with the smell of fresh coffee, and every corner shined under bright lights. Among the many people who worked in this building, there was one man who went mostly unnoticed. His name was Samuel. He wore a simple black janitor's uniform, carried his mop and broom, and quietly did his work without bothering anyone. To most people, Samuel was invisible. He was the one who cleaned up after the office closed, wiped the desks, and made sure the building stayed spotless. One afternoon, in the middle of a busy workday, the CEO of the company, Clara Hayes, gathered some of her senior staff in the grand lobby. Clara was a woman in her early 30s, confident, sharp, and admired by many for her strong leadership. She always walked with her head high, her heels clicking on the marble floor like they owned the ground. Employees respected her, but some also whispered that she carried too much pride. She was quick-witted and often made remarks that showed her superiority. That day, Clara was speaking with a few directors about an upcoming event when her eyes drifted toward the large grand piano in the lobby. It was a beautiful instrument, placed there for decoration, polished so well that it sparkled under the lights. Few people ever touched it, and it mostly stood as a symbol of class and culture in the company's luxurious building. Clara, in her playful but proud manner, smirked and made a remark. "You know," she said, leaning slightly against the edge of the piano, "if anyone here could sit down and play Chopin perfectly, I would marry them on the spot." Her tone was joking, her eyes glimmering with arrogance. The directors around her laughed politely. To them, it was just a light comment, another way for the CEO to show her high standards. After all, how could anyone in this office, filled with accountants, marketers, and managers, suddenly sit at the piano and play Chopin? It sounded impossible, almost like a challenge thrown into the air without meaning. But not everyone in the lobby laughed. Samuel, who had been mopping quietly in the corner, froze for a moment. He lifted his head and looked at Clara. She didn't notice him. Nobody did. He was just the janitor, a background figure in the grand scene of corporate life. Yet the word struck him deeply. Chopin. That name carried memories from long ago, memories he kept locked away in his heart. Some of the younger employees, noticing Samuel pause, smirked and whispered among themselves. "Hey, maybe the janitor will give it a try," one of them joked softly. Another chuckled, "Yeah, imagine him playing piano in those work boots." They laughed, not to be cruel, but because the idea seemed too far-fetched. Samuel didn't reply. He simply bent down, wrung out his mop, and kept cleaning the floor as if nothing had happened. But inside, something stirred. Long ago, before life had pushed him onto a different path, Samuel had been close to music. He remembered the old piano in his grandmother's small living room. She had saved coins for years to buy that second-hand instrument, its keys yellowed with age, some of them sticking. As a child, Samuel would sit for hours, trying to copy the melodies he heard on the radio. His grandmother, with her warm smile, always encouraged him. One day, she used to say, "Your music will open doors for you." But life had not gone as planned. Hardship came early, and Samuel had to give up lessons, give up practice, and step into the world of labor. His grandmother passed away, and with her, his dream slowly faded. He found work wherever he could, and eventually, he ended up as a janitor in the skyscraper. Though his hands now held brooms and mops, deep inside him, music never died. Clara's careless remark had awakened something in him. He didn't think about marrying her, that thought never crossed his mind. What struck him was the arrogance in her tone, the way she believed such talent was rare, unreachable, almost as if no one around her could possibly rise to such a standard. Samuel knew differently. The rest of the day passed as usual. Employees rushed about, papers shuffled, meetings dragged on. Samuel kept cleaning, moving silently through the building, always present but unnoticed. Yet, all the while, Clara's words replayed in his head: "If anyone here could sit down and play Chopin perfectly, I would marry them on the spot." When the evening came, and the last of the staff left the building, Samuel finished his duties and walked out into the cool night air. The city lights sparkled, and cars honked in the distance. His steps slowed as he passed by a small church near the corner of the street. Through the window, he caught a glimpse of an old upright piano sitting quietly in the corner. His heart tugged. He hadn't touched piano keys in years, yet the sight of it felt like seeing an old friend. He paused at the door, then shook his head and kept walking. "No," he whispered to himself. "Those days are gone." But the thought wouldn't leave him. That night, as he lay in his modest apartment, he could almost hear the notes of Chopin's nocturne in his head. His fingers twitched as if they still remembered the keys. Sleep came late, and when it did, it was filled with dreams of music. The next morning, Samuel returned to work as usual. The office buzzed with life, and Clara, in her usual style, walked confidently among her staff. But now, whenever Samuel passed by the grand piano in the lobby, his eyes lingered just a second longer. He didn't smile, didn't frown, but deep inside, a quiet decision was taking shape. No one in the building knew what he once was, what he once dreamed of, or what skills he still carried within him. To them, he was just the janitor. But Samuel knew something else: the heart of a person could never be measured by their uniform, their title, or their place in society. And though Clara had meant her words as nothing more than a playful challenge, Samuel was beginning to think, maybe it was time to remind the world, and perhaps even himself, who he truly was. The stage had not yet been set, but the story had begun. The following day in the tall skyscraper, life continued as it always did. Phones rang, printers hummed, and the sound of hurried footsteps echoed across the polished floors. Employees were busy with their tasks, yet there was a subtle energy in the air. Clara's playful remark about Chopin had traveled quickly among the staff. People repeated it in the hallways, at the coffee machine, and even during lunch breaks. Some laughed at how impossible it sounded. Others joked about who might attempt it. But most saw it as nothing more than their CEO showing off her refined taste once again. Samuel, meanwhile, worked quietly, just as he always had. He swept the corridors, polished the glass doors, and emptied the bins. Yet beneath his calm expression, his heart carried weight. Every time he passed by a group of employees, he caught fragments of their whispers. "Did you hear what the boss said yesterday?" one young intern giggled. "She said she'd marry anyone who could play Chopin." "Imagine that." Another replied, "Yeah, but who in this place could do that? We're accountants, not pianists." Someone else added, "Well, maybe the janitor will surprise us." The group laughed, and though Samuel pretended not to hear, their voices followed him like a shadow. He did not feel anger. Instead, he felt a quiet stirring, a mix of pain and longing. Their words reminded him how little anyone knew about his past, about the boy who once believed music could carry him to places he had only dreamed of. That evening, after his shift ended, Samuel walked slowly through the city. The streets glowed under the warm yellow of streetlights. He found himself once again standing outside the small church he had noticed before. The tall wooden doors looked worn, yet welcoming. From inside, faint light glimmered, and he could just see the outline of the old upright piano in the corner. He stood there for a long time, his hands in his pockets, his breath forming clouds in the cool night air. At last, he stepped forward and gently pushed the door open. The church was quiet, filled with the soft scent of old wood and candle wax. The priest, an elderly man with kind eyes, looked up from a book. "Good evening," the priest said warmly. Can I help you? Samuel hesitated, then pointed toward the piano. Father, I was wondering, would it be all right if I sat there for a while? I used to play, long ago. The priest's face brightened. Of course. Music is always welcome here. That piano has been silent for too long. Samuel walked slowly to the instrument. His fingers brushed across the dusty keys, and a rush of memories filled his heart. He could see his grandmother's face, hear her gentle encouragement, and feel again the passion that once burned in his young soul. Sitting on the worn bench, he closed his eyes and pressed a single key. The sound was soft, imperfect, yet it reached into him like a voice calling from the past. At first, his fingers stumbled. It had been years, and the notes did not flow easily. But as he continued, the music began to return. The old melodies he had once practiced came back, shaky but alive. Soon, the church was filled with the faint strains of Chopin, the notes echoing against the walls, blending with the silence of the sacred space. The priest listened from his seat, smiling gently. "You play beautifully," he said when Samuel paused. Samuel shook his head. "Not anymore. I am rusty. But I want to remember. I need to remember." Night after night, Samuel returned. After long hours of cleaning and mopping floors, he would slip into the church and sit at the piano. Each evening, he practiced a little more, his fingers growing stronger, his confidence slowly returning. The tiredness in his body from work was heavy, but the music gave him strength. Meanwhile, at the office, Clara carried on with her routines, never thinking twice about her remark. She gave orders, led meetings, and smiled her proud smile. She didn't realize that her words had lit a fire in someone she barely noticed. Some employees, however, began to notice Samuel's change. Though he worked with the same quietness, there was a calm focus about him now, a determination in the way he carried himself. One evening, as he was leaving, a kind receptionist asked softly, "Samuel, do you play piano?" He paused, surprised. "Why do you ask?" She smiled. "Because you always stop for a second at the piano in the lobby. I've seen it. And, you look like you're hearing music in your head." Samuel gave a small nod but said nothing more. He wasn't ready to reveal his secret. That night, he sat once again at the church piano, practicing the delicate notes of Chopin's Nocturne. His fingers moved with more certainty, and the music began to flow as if it had been waiting all these years to return. He felt his grandmother's presence in every note, as though she were sitting beside him, whispering encouragement. At times, tears filled his eyes. This wasn't about Clara's promise or her careless challenge. It wasn't about proving himself to others. It was about reclaiming the part of him that had been buried under years of struggle and silence. Still, in the back of his mind, Samuel knew the day would come when he might sit at the grand piano in the company's lobby. The thought both scared and excited him. He imagined the faces of the staff, the sudden silence, the shock when the janitor would reveal something no one expected. And so, day by day, he prepared. While others laughed at the impossibility of the challenge, Samuel carried a secret. He knew that the world often judged people by their uniforms, by their jobs, by their positions in life. But he also knew that true talent, true spirit, could never be hidden forever. The days turned into weeks. The whispers around the office grew quiet as people moved on to new topics, forgetting the CEO's remark. Yet Samuel never forgot. Every note he practiced was a step towards something greater. And in the silence of the church, where only the flicker of candles kept him company, the janitor in his black uniform transformed once more into the musician he was always meant to be. The challenge had been given. The decision had been made. The music was alive again, and Samuel was ready to carry it wherever fate might lead him. The winter mornings were colder now, and the city seemed to move more quickly each day. Samuel continued his work at the skyscraper with the same dedication he had always shown. He polished the marble floors, dusted the high glass walls, and emptied bins without complaint. To anyone watching, he was the same quiet janitor in his black uniform, blending into the background. But deep inside, something was changing. Each evening after work, he still walked to the little church with the worn wooden doors. He still sat at the old upright piano, letting his fingers dance over the keys until the late hours of the night. The sound of Chopin's music slowly became smoother, clearer, richer. The first nights had been filled with stumbles and pauses, but now the melodies flowed with strength. Sometimes, the priest would sit at the back, listening quietly, his eyes closed as the music filled the empty church. Sometimes, the sound of the piano carried through the open window and into the street, where passers-by would pause and glance in, surprised that such beauty was hidden inside. Samuel himself felt as though he were rediscovering a part of his soul. Each time he touched the keys, he remembered his grandmother's words, "One day, your music will open doors for you." And though the years of hardship had closed many doors, this one, the door to music, was open again. At work, Samuel carried his secret with quiet pride. But the more he practiced, the harder it became to hide the small signs. Some of the employees noticed the faint rhythm in his footsteps as he moved his mop across the floor. Others noticed the way he sometimes hummed softly under his breath while working late. The receptionist who had once asked about the piano grew even more curious, but Samuel only smiled gently whenever she mentioned it. One afternoon, as Samuel was polishing the lobby floor near the grand piano, two young interns passed by. One of them stopped and tapped the shiny black surface of the piano. "Such a waste, isn't it?" he said. "A piano this beautiful and nobody ever plays it?" The other laughed. "Well, except maybe the boss, if she wants to show off during one of her events." Samuel kept his head down, but his ears caught every word. His fingers itched to touch the keys right then and there, but he reminded himself it wasn't time yet. He had to be ready not just to play a few notes, but to truly show the heart of the music. Meanwhile, Clara, the CEO, never gave her remark another thought. For her, it was a playful comment, forgotten as quickly as it was spoken. She spent her days in meetings, discussing new deals, and planning the company's future. She walked past Samuel many times, her sharp heels echoing against the floor, but never once did she look closely at him. To her, he was still invisible. But for Samuel, her words were alive, echoing in his memory every night as he practiced. He didn't want her promise. He didn't dream of her hand in marriage. What he wanted was to show that the janitor she overlooked carried within him something greater than anyone could imagine. The weeks passed. Samuel's routine never changed in the eyes of others, but inside, his quiet preparation grew deeper. He studied Chopin's pieces with the care of a craftsman, breaking down each phrase, practicing until his fingers obeyed without hesitation. Sometimes he made mistakes and felt frustrated, but he never gave up. The more he practiced, the more the music became part of him again. One evening, as he finished a long practice session, the priest walked up to him with a smile. "You play with soul," the priest said. "Not many people can do that. You don't just touch the keys, you speak through them. Are you preparing for something?" Samuel hesitated. He had told no one his true reason. But at last, he nodded. "Yes, Father. There is a piano at my workplace. And one day, I think I will have to play there." The priest patted his shoulder kindly. "Then play not for them, but for yourself. Let your heart speak. That is when music is most powerful." Those words stayed with Samuel. At the office, the anticipation began to grow quietly. Some employees still remembered Clara's challenge. They joked about it in whispers, wondering if anyone would ever dare. A few teased Samuel lightly, not expecting any answer. "Hey Samuel," one said with a grin, When are you going to play for the boss? Chopin, right? Maybe she'll promote you. Samuel only smiled, replying with his usual calm. Some things take time. They laughed and moved on, not realizing he meant every word. The receptionist, however, began to believe there was more to him. She often stayed late, and once, she swore she heard Samuel humming a Chopin melody as he cleaned. She mentioned it to a colleague, who shrugged. No way. He's a janitor, not a pianist. But still, the thought lingered. As the month neared its end, the company prepared for a small gathering in the lobby. It was to celebrate a new partnership, and Clara wanted everything perfect. The marble floors shined, the glass sparkled, and the grand piano stood proudly in the center, polished to perfection. Clara ordered flowers to be placed near it, though no one expected the piano to actually be used. That week, Samuel practiced harder than ever. He knew the gathering would be his moment. He didn't plan it to impress Clara or make her keep her joking promise. He wanted to play because the piano was meant to be played, because music was meant to be shared, and because sometimes, a person must show the world who they truly are. The night before the event, Samuel sat in the church longer than usual. The candles burned low as his fingers moved across the keys, weaving Chopin's melody into the silence. His eyes closed, and for a moment, he wasn't in the church, nor in the skyscraper. He was back in his grandmother's living room, her gentle smile shining beside him, her voice whispering encouragement. When he finished, the priest clapped softly. "You are ready," he said. Samuel nodded. "Yes," he whispered. "Tomorrow, it will be time." He walked home through the quiet streets, his heart calm. For years, people had only seen him as the janitor in black. But tomorrow, for the first time, they would see something else. They would see the man who carried music in his soul. And in the tall glass skyscraper, the grand piano waited silently, unaware that it was about to come alive in the hands of someone nobody expected. The morning of the event arrived, and the skyscraper buzzed with unusual energy. Employees hurried about, carrying files, arranging flowers, and checking the decorations in the grand lobby. The marble floor sparkled like water under the bright lights, and the tall glass walls reflected the glow of the city outside. At the center of the room, the grand piano stood proudly, polished until its surface shone like a mirror. Clara Hayes, the CEO, moved gracefully through the preparations, her heels clicking against the floor. She inspected everything with her sharp eyes, making sure not a single detail was out of place. The partnership ceremony was important to her. It wasn't just about signing a deal, it was about showing the company's power, its style, and her own image as a leader who could make things happen. For everyone else, it was just another corporate event, but for Samuel, it was something entirely different. As he mopped a far corner of the lobby that morning, his eyes kept returning to the piano. He felt a calmness inside him, the same calmness he had found each night at the church. His decision was clear. Today was the day. By early afternoon, the guests began arriving, partners from another company, senior directors and managers. Employees gathered in groups, whispering excitedly. The sound of laughter and conversation filled the air. Trays of sparkling drinks were passed around, and the scent of fresh flowers mixed with the smell of polished wood. Samuel worked quietly at the edges, unseen but present. His black uniform blended into the background, but his heart beat steadily with anticipation. He remembered every note he had practiced, every moment at the church, every encouraging word from his grandmother long ago. This was not about pride, nor about the careless remark Clara had once made. This was about reminding himself and maybe others that true worth cannot be hidden forever. When the speeches began, Clara stepped forward with her usual poise. She welcomed the guests warmly, speaking of success, growth, and partnership. Her words drew polite applause, and she smiled with confidence. Behind her, The piano sat untouched, like a silent witness waiting for its story to be told. As the speeches ended and the atmosphere shifted to mingling, Samuel moved slowly toward the piano. Some employees noticed him and frowned with confusion. A few whispered, "What is he doing?" Others smirked, thinking it might be a joke. The janitor, near the piano? It was almost amusing. But Samuel did not hear their whispers. His steps were steady, his face calm. He reached the bench, pulled it gently, and sat down. His rough, work-worn hands hovered above the shining keys. For a moment, he closed his eyes and drew in a deep breath. The room, filled with chatter, seemed not to notice him until he pressed the first note. The sound rang clear, strong, and beautiful. Conversations faltered. Glasses paused midair. Slowly, heads turned toward the piano. Samuel's fingers began to move with confidence, weaving Chopin's melody into the air. The music rose and fell like a river, flowing through the lobby, echoing off the glass and marble, filling every corner of the space. The staff stood frozen, their eyes wide. Some covered their mouths in surprise. The same people who had once whispered and laughed now stood silent, unable to believe what they were seeing. The janitor, the man in black who cleaned their floors, was playing Chopin with a grace and passion that none of them could have imagined. Even Clara, who had been speaking with a guest, turned sharply at the sound. Her smirk disappeared, replaced by astonishment. She stepped closer, her eyes fixed on Samuel's hands as they moved effortlessly across the keys. For the first time, she saw him not as the janitor but as something entirely different, an artist, a man who carried music in his soul. The melody grew richer, the notes cascading like light rain, then soaring like a bird in flight. Samuel's face remained calm, but his heart poured into every note. Each sound carried his struggles, his memories, and his dreams. He wasn't just playing Chopin, he was telling his life story without words. The lobby grew so quiet that one could hear only the music. Not a whisper, not a footstep, not even the clink of a glass disturbed the performance. Everyone, directors, interns, guests, even Clara herself, was held captive by the sound. As the piece reached its final notes, Samuel's hand slowed, his touch gentle, his expression peaceful. The last note lingered in the air, hanging like a soft echo before fading into silence. For a heartbeat, the room remained still, as if no one dared to breathe. Then, suddenly, the silence broke into thunderous applause. The employees clapped wildly, their eyes shining with amazement. Some even shouted words of praise. Guests joined in, standing, their respect clear in their faces. The applause rolled through the lobby like a wave, rising higher and higher. Samuel stood slowly, bowing his head with quiet humility. He did not smile proudly, but his eyes shone with a soft light. To him, this moment was not about glory, but about truth. He had shared his gift, and in doing so, he had reclaimed a part of himself long hidden. Clara stepped forward, her face still filled with astonishment. She looked at Samuel as though seeing him for the first time. Her earlier remark about marrying anyone who could play Chopin now echoed back in her mind, and for the first time in her career, she felt humbled. "You," she said softly, her voice almost uncertain. "You can truly play?" Samuel met her eyes calmly. "Yes," he said simply. "I can." There was no arrogance in his tone, no bitterness, only honesty. He hadn't played for her promise or for their applause. He had played because music lived inside him, and it deserved to be heard. The crowd slowly quieted, though their admiration still filled the air. Clara took a deep breath, then turned to the staff and guests. "Today," she said, her voice firm but softer than usual, "we witnessed something extraordinary. Talent can come from anywhere. And perhaps, we must all learn to look closer at the people around us." Her words carried weight, and the staff nodded in agreement. For many of them, their view of Samuel would never be the same. He was no longer invisible, no longer just the man with the mop and broom. He was Samuel, the musician, the man who had shocked them all with his gift. As the evening continued, people approached him with respect. Some shook his hand, some thanked him, others simply smiled, still too stunned to speak. Samuel accepted it all with quiet grace, his heart steady. When the event finally ended and the guests left, the grand piano remained, still glowing from the touch of his hands. Samuel returned to his duties, picking up his mop as if nothing had changed. But deep inside, he knew everything had. The applause faded slowly, but the memory of the music stayed heavy in the air. Even after Samuel had stood from the piano and quietly stepped back, people continued to look at him with wide eyes, as though they had just discovered something magical in the most unexpected place. Some were still whispering in disbelief, others clapped him on the back as they walked past, and many simply stared, their respect clear in their faces. For Clara Hayes, the CEO, it was a moment she could not forget. Her own careless words from weeks earlier echoed in her mind: "If anyone here could sit down and play Chopin perfectly, I would marry them on the spot." At the time, it had been nothing more than a smirk, a playful challenge, something she believed was far beyond the reach of anyone in her office. Yet now, standing before her, was the janitor she had hardly noticed, who had just played Chopin with a grace that silenced the entire building. For the first time in her career, Clara felt her confidence slip. It was not embarrassment, but something deeper: humility. She realized how quick she had been to judge, how easy it had been to believe that skill and brilliance belonged only to those with high titles and fine suits. She looked at Samuel and saw not the uniform he wore, but the man behind it. "Samuel," she said softly, almost unsure if he would even turn. But he did, his calm eyes meeting hers. "Yes, ma'am," he replied. Her lips parted, then pressed together again as if she struggled to find the right words. At last, she said, "What you did today, it was extraordinary. You have a gift that deserves respect. And I owe you an apology." The staff around them exchanged surprised glances. Clara Hayes was not known for apologies. Yet in this moment, her tone was genuine, her face sincere. Samuel smiled faintly. "You don't need to apologize, Miss Hayes. I didn't play to prove anything. I played because it's who I am." His words, simple yet powerful, sank into everyone listening. He wasn't seeking recognition or reward, he had only wanted to share his gift. The next few days in the skyscraper felt different. People no longer passed Samuel without seeing him. They greeted him with smiles, nodded respectfully, and some even stopped to talk. The receptionist, who had long suspected his secret, congratulated him warmly. "I knew there was something special about you," she said with a grin. Managers who once walked past him without a glance now paused to ask how long he had been playing, or whether he had ever studied music formally. Interns whispered about how incredible the performance had been. And Samuel, though he accepted their praise kindly, never let it change his humble nature. He still swept the floors, polished the glass, and emptied the bins with the same dedication as before. But now, he did it with a new light in his eyes, a quiet confidence that came from being seen. Clara herself found her thoughts returning to Samuel often. She replayed the performance in her mind, the way the notes had risen and fallen, the way his fingers had moved with both strength and tenderness. It was more than just skill, it was soul. She realized that the janitor she had once overlooked carried within him a richness that no resume or degree could measure. At the next staff meeting, Clara addressed the employees. "What happened during our event was more than just a performance," she said. "It was a reminder that talent and dignity are not limited to job titles. We must never underestimate the people around us. Everyone has a story, and everyone carries gifts we may not see at first." Her words carried across the room, and many nodded thoughtfully. It was unusual for Clara to speak in such a reflective way, but the truth of Samuel's music had touched even her. Later that week, Samuel received an unexpected request. A guest from the event, impressed by his playing, had asked if he would perform at a local charity concert. At first, Samuel hesitated. He wasn't used to standing in front of crowds, and his life had been built around quiet work, not the stage. But the priest from the church encouraged him. Music is meant to be shared, the priest reminded him. You never know whose heart you may touch. And so, Samuel agreed. The charity concert was held in a modest hall, filled with families, children, and ordinary people from the city. When Samuel sat at the piano, dressed not in his janitor's uniform but in a simple suit, the crowd waited curiously. Then he began to play, and once again, the beauty of Chopin's music filled the air. The audience listened in silence, then erupted in applause, just as the office staff had done before. For Samuel, it was not about fame or recognition. It was about honoring the gift that had been given to him, about remembering his grandmother's sacrifice, about keeping alive the part of himself that had once been buried. Back at the skyscraper, life eventually settled into its normal rhythm again. The phones rang, meetings stretched long, and the marble floors still shined under Samuel's careful work. But something had changed forever. No one saw him the same way anymore. To them, he was not just the janitor. He was the man who had sat at the grand piano and stunned an entire room with his heart. Clara, too, had changed. She carried herself with the same confidence, but there was a softness now, a deeper awareness. She made an effort to know the names of people she once overlooked. She spoke with more patience, listened more closely, and smiled more sincerely. Though her life was still busy with business deals and leadership, she never forgot the moment when a janitor reminded her of the greatness hidden in ordinary people. As for Samuel, he continued his life quietly, but with a renewed sense of peace. He knew he might never be famous, and he didn't need to be. His music had already fulfilled its purpose. It had restored his dignity, touched the hearts of those around him, and proved that dreams, though delayed, could never be destroyed completely. One evening, as he walked past the grand piano in the lobby after finishing his shift, he paused. The lobby was empty, the lights soft. He sat down for just a moment and played a gentle melody, not for anyone else, but for himself. The notes rose softly, carrying into the stillness, and he smiled. Samuel was still the janitor in the black uniform. But now, he was also something more, the man who had reminded a CEO, a company, and perhaps even an entire city, that greatness can come from the quietest places, and that sometimes, the most unexpected people carry the most extraordinary gifts.